These are excerpts from the book The Reagan Revolution and the Developing Countries. Okay, to begin with, quote, we will examine the very, very long-term historical development of global society. Why the very, very long-term historical development? Because in order to analyze the future, it is not enough simply to know the present or the immediate past. The evolution of world society depends on its entire past history. To paraphrase Perry Anderson, 1974, a society's past lies behind it, but in many cases, society's past also lies in front of it. Anybody who reads the newspapers knows how often the past, often the distant past, will reemerge to play an important role in the present. In other words, to paraphrase E.L. Jones, 1994, we will need a very long runway for our relatively short flight into the future. Our runway will start in the middle of the last millennium, when most of the societies that comprise the modern world were already in existence. Quote, in a primitive cross-section taken about the year 1775, the area of Western society is almost restricted to what were then the dominions of Charlemagne, together with the English successor states of the Roman Empire in Britain. Outside these limits, almost all of the Iberian Peninsula belongs to the state, at this date, to the domain of Muslim Arab Caliphate. Let us call Western society, Western Christendom, and as soon as we bring our mental image of it into focus by finding a name for it, the images of its counterparts in the contemporary world once come into focus side by side with it, especially if we keep our attention fixed on the cultural plane. On this plane, we can distinguish unmistakably the presence in the world today of at least 4 other living societies. 1, an Orthodox Christian society in southeastern Europe and Russia. 2, an Islamic society with its focus in the arid zone, which stretches diagonally across North Africa and the Middle East from the Atlantic to the outer face of the Great Wall of China. 3, a Hindu society in the tropical subcontinent of India. And 4, a Far Eastern society in the subtropical and temperate regions between the arid zones and the Pacific. It is interesting to note that when we turn back to 775 AD, we find that the number and identity of the societies on the world map are nearly the same as at the present time. Substantially, the world map of societies has remained constant since the first emergence of Western society. In the struggle for existence, the West has driven its contemporaries to the wall and entangled them in the meshes of its economic and political ascendancy, but it has not yet disarmed them of their distinctive cultures. Unquote. A. Toynbee, 1959. The West, the Islamic world, and Byzantine civilization all developed out of the wreckage of the Roman Empire. While it is probably stretching it a bit to say that contemporary Russia is a descendant of Byzantium, if we make that connection, we can then say that all the societies of the contemporary world, the developed societies of the West, the transforming societies of the East, and the underdeveloped societies of the South were, from a cultural point of view, already in existence or emerging as far back as the 8th century AD. At that time, a sort of, quote, critical mass, unquote, of knowledge and capabilities seems to have built up in world society, so that the succeeding 1,000-year period was to see a series of rapid and explosive advances in different parts of the world successively, the last and most significant of which was the European Industrial Revolution. Okay, moving on. We're now going to move to the new growth theories and institutional change. Everyone agrees that the new growth theories provide very valuable insights into the economic growth process. However, they remain controversial. They have been criticized for being too ambitious, for attempting to explain too much by means of mathematical formulas. J. Stiglitz, 1990, for example, describes them as being characterized by, quote, a certain amount of chutzpah combined with a high level of technical ingenuity. In the same way that the new growth theories attempt to model the generation of new technologies, some of which will inevitably involve facts of nature which are not as yet known and could be quite surprising when they are discovered, so too do these new growth theories propose to explain institutional, historical, social, cultural, and political change as well. Quote, changes in institutions can solve the problem of explaining the time trend in growth rates, but they do so by exchanging exogenous technological change for exogenous institutional change. Making institutional change exogenous allows economists to conduct a provisional analysis that focuses on issues that they understand relatively well and sets aside ones that they do not. But ultimately, one would like to be able to explain the evolution of institutions as well. It seems quite plausible that increasing rates of return and increasing opportunities for private investment caused the evolution of institutions that supported these activities. Quote unquote, Paul Romer, 1991. Many historians think the important change of historical causality went in the reverse direction. Quote, in Europe, the private trade sector had evolved from the wreckage of central authority during the Dark Ages. The small scale of early government attached itself to trade for the sake of the revenues that sector could quickly provide. In China and Asia, generally, the private sector emerged only after government on suffrage. No independent laws arose to shield it. Contractual legalism never replaced status morality. The Chinese in particular showed signs of development, but nonetheless was turned aside by the dead-end opportunity of internal colonizations. E.L. Jones, 1981. During the early feudal stages in Europe, a pattern of development began in which technology, the watermill Roman, the heavy plow Slavic, the three-field system, the horseshoe Celtic, and a new method of harnessing draft animals, China, began to be assimilated and applied to agricultural production at a very rapid rate, promoting a growth in output which over the long term exceeded demographic growth, something not true in the classical civilizations. Furthermore, the institutions to block these activities had not had time to arise. The Carolingian Empire fell apart, the Mongol invasion of 13th century Europe stopped short of Western Europe, etc. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century stopped short of Western Europe, etc. In other words, a division of human society into a developed West, a centralized East, and an underdeveloped South began 1,000 years ago. It was at this time that in Western Europe that a new type of society emerged in which productive growth in advance of population growth emerged as a, quote, social organizing principle, unquote, involving the formation of decentralized stocks of capital and decentralized political power centers. It involved the growth of feudal society, the growth of contractual relations, the dependence of the monarchs on the merchant classes in the towns, the rapid expansion of trade, and ultimately the scientific and industrial revolutions. Why, after so many thousands of years of agricultural civilizations, such an unprecedented and unique form of social and historical evolution should have occurred in the small western promontory of Eurasia is ultimately a mystery. It has something to do with Christianity, something to do with the prior Celtic and Germano-Roman cultures, something to do with the natures of the decaying Roman society, something to do with the geographic, climatic, environmental, and epidemiological nature of Europe. Its eastward spread was hampered by the nomadic invasions of the 13th century, which in turn determined the centralized shape of the Russian political economy. The South was formed by 500 years of colonization by the West of what is now the underdeveloped world: South America, Africa, the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, Safavid Persia, the Qing dynasty, and East Asia. All of this greatly influenced the differing amounts of human capital in different sectors of the world. It's no accident, for example, that Japan, the only non-Western society to fully join the developed world, was spared both the Mongol invasion and European colonization, and had a feudal social structure closer to that of pre-industrial Europe. Closer to that of pre-industrial Europe than to the centralized political structure of the classical civilizations of antiquity. Can the results of such long-term historical evolution really be described by means of mathematical equations? If not, it certainly won't be for lack of trying. Some new growth theorists are attempting to do just that. M. Kramer, 1992, A. Adris, and T. Verdier, 1993. Okay, moving on to a comparison of long-term long-term Japanese development as contrasted to long-term Russian development. We want to say also, first to begin, that this book was written in 1993. Russia had not yet successfully privatized and not yet successfully not yet has successfully inserted itself into the world global market. Later on, Russia was to do so. In fact, its output doubled under Putin, and its standard of living rose significantly. And as we predicted, this was because of the increase, the growth in the markets of the developing world. Okay, now to go on. Okay, in China, as in the Islamic world, the use of cultural values to explain progress or the lack of it has to be viewed with skepticism. For example, Weber used Confucian values to explain China's failure to industrialize, and later analysts have used the same Confucian values to explain the ability of the Pacific Rim to industrialize. In fact, the real significance of Confucian values for our purposes lies in the differences between China and Japan. It was because the Japanese worldview was an incomplete, not yet fully developed variant of the Chinese Confucian worldview that it was more easily transcended by Japan's successful assimilation of the modern Western worldview. This, according to Samir Amin's thesis, was an important reason why Japan, as opposed to China, escaped the destructive effects of European colonialism and went on to develop a successful capitalist economy. One of the important factors behind this outcome was the Japanese feudal system. Following Amin, 1989, we can describe the Japanese feudal system as an underdeveloped version of the Chinese tributary system. Under the Taika reform of 646 AD and the Taiho codes of 702 AD, Japan instituted a countrywide administrative system modeled after the Tang dynasty in China. By the middle of this millennium, this system, which included excuse me, this system, which included a countrywide administrative system after the Tang, model after the Tang dynasty in China. By the middle of this millennium, this system, which also included an imperial dynasty and an official religion based on Buddhism and Shintoism, and evolved into a feudal system with striking parallels to feudal Europe. The emperor had evolved into a sort of religious figure, but the real power was vested in a military structure known as the Bakufu, headed by a generalissimo shogun. Under the Tokugawa shogunate of 1615 to 1868, the shogun's royal domain, tenure lands, included about 20% of the country. There were several hundred feudal lords, daimyo, who owned and governed fiefs, han, and who retained warriors, known as bushi or samurai. Okay, to continue, this will be continued. This will be continued.